notwithstanding the fact that this morning Lisa gave us a very provocative quote-unquote historical discussion and a very, very interesting and moving quote-unquote historical documentary, I would hazard to say that she was already doing sociology. Much of what she was doing was sociologically relevant and will mesh very nicely, I think, with our discussion in the next hour. So essentially what I'd like to do is warm you up to do some analysis. And the analysis I want you to do is on a series of education-related videos, short ones, relevant to educational policy, educational research, and educational practice, what teachers do in their classrooms. But before we go there, we're going to spend some time, as I say, just kind of warming ourselves up and putting ourselves into what I would call a sociological frame of mind. And for me, a sociological frame of mind means questions. Questions. Asking the kinds of questions that invoke sometimes, as Lisa put it, some very difficult responses. They're analytical, they're critical, they're focused. Those are the kinds of questions that I'm going to encourage you to get into the habit of thinking about as educators and as prospective educators. The tools are going to be, I'm going to introduce you to, and some of you who have studied sociology, this will be very familiar to you. Just touch on some of the broad conceptual frameworks that have informed sociology and sociology of education for the last almost 200 years. And inquiry, of course, because in the end, this is about inquiring into what you're doing. And inquiring what you're doing as educators and inquiring into what that broader system of education does or doesn't do. Okay, so where do we start? How about the beginning? Before we move to sociology of education, a few thoughts on sociology. So I turn to three of the biggies. The first one is the so-called father of sociology. Is there a mother of sociology? I'm sure there are mothers of sociology somewhere. But this is the so-called father of sociology, Auguste Comte. Comte says the science of sociology is the science of social phenomena subject to natural and invariable laws, the discovery of which is the object of investigation. If it's sounding an awful lot like the natural sciences, that isn't an accident. That's not an historical accident. Fast forward 100 years to the British sociologist Maurice Ginsburg. Ginsburg says, in the broadest sense, sociology is the study of human interactions and interrelations, their conditions and consequences. Fast forward closer to the end of the last century, another famous British sociologist, Anthony Giddens, says, sociology is the study of human social life, groups, and societies. It is a dazzling and compelling enterprise, having as its subject matter our own behavior as social beings. I'm sharing these three with you in the first case to give you a sense of the very broad scope of sociology. The fact that it interests itself in just about anything that you could imagine that involves interactions between individuals and collectives. But as I was putting these quotes together, what was really interesting to me, I looked at them once and then again, and I'm like, this is amazing. What these quotes also do is they trace out a trajectory in the evolution of sociology, right? So we're moving from natural and invariable laws, right? A search for rules and laws that apparently govern the way individuals and societies interact. We're moving from those objective laws, very much like the kind of laws that the natural sciences invokes. From there, 100 years later, we're moving to human interactions and interrelations. Can you almost, the texture of the definition, you can feel how different it is. One is very much an objective statement of fact, and the second one, you can feel it beginning to recognize the complex texture of human interactions. Right? So we've gone from a very macro level perspective to one that's a little bit closer to human experience. And once we get to Giddens, something really dramatic happens. He uses a collective pronoun, which includes himself in a definition of sociology. our own behavior as social beings. I'm assuming that Anthony Giddens considers himself to be one of our own. So he's factoring his own behavior into this. This is a massive leap in the space of what, 150 years, to move from sociology as the study of rules and laws, objective rules and laws governing a reality that is in some way external to the person who's looking at it, to Giddens, who gives us a definition which by implication says, I can't look at a sociological reality without in some way shaping it. I'm part of my research. Right? And this is hardly a surprise. I mean, the 20th century I call it the interpretive century. It's the century that said you can't stand outside the world and pretend that you're observing it objectively. You're part of the darn thing. And physicists like Heisenberg, from physicists like Heisenberg to no, please feel free to, I'm thinking of somebody else. I'm thinking of, see, I've lost that example. The point here, yes, how could I forget? Martin Heidegger, right, the famous existential philosopher. I mean, Heidegger makes this point that being in the world is inseparable from being. Again, he's making the same point. You can't stand outside of the reality that you're trying to observe. You're part of it, right? And Heisenberg did that really in a really interesting way, in ways that I don't understand, because he was talking about subatomic physics. Some of you may know the Heisenberg effect, right? You can't look at the subatomic particle and affect the subatomic particle by your very observation. Right, so this is the kind of evolution you see not just in other disciplines, but it's something that kind of bleeds out into all of the major disciplines, and sociology is one of them. Last night, as I was reviewing this, I thought, you know what, you could have put in a fourth step. And the fourth step would have been what some people call a post-structural sociology. A post-structural sociology takes this business about including myself in the study of sociology and says, all right, if you're going to include yourself, then you're going to also have to account for the fact you're going to have to start asking difficult questions like, why are you asking this particular question at this particular time? How are you going to interpret your results? What are you going to do with your results? Say the critics of TDSB's race data collection test scores based on race. What are you going to do with those things? You start asking like, great, who's funding your research and why are they funding it? So you can see how we go from this very neat interpretive exercise to something that gets really, really sticky. So again, the method to my madness is twofold here. One, to give you a broad sense of conceptually how sociology gets factored out, and also to map out what I think is a very clear disciplinary evolution that has an impact on the person who's doing the researching and the asking of the questions. Okay, now, so what kind of questions might sociology address? I picked 3 thematic categories that I thought might be relevant to education. I picked communication, I picked economics, and I picked immigration and acculturation. These are the kinds of questions I imagine sociology might ask. And I hope if you don't take anything else away from this, I want you to take away the fact that there are an infinite number of questions that you can start asking in a sociological vein. It requires a particular inclination, a particular set of conceptual tools, and then an infinite list of questions. I felt kind of vindicated this morning. There were several references to CBC. I picked CBC too when I was thinking about sociology in a Canadian context. Okay, what's relevant here? And CBC obviously is relevant. It's had a bearing on Canada's history. And if nothing else, we pay money into it. We fund it. So it's worth asking questions about it. What impact does the CBC have on the lives of Canadians? And is this impact distributed differentially across demographic groups? That strikes me as a quintessentially Canadian sociological question relevant to communication. I got 3 of them here. Do first-generation Canadians listen to CBC radio or watch CBC television or visit the CBC online? Does the CBC serve as a point of contact between first-generation Canadians and broader Canadian society? Part of the motivation for this question is coming from my own school-based research with minority communities, most of whom, I must say, don't listen to the CBC or watch the CBC or visit the CBC online. A final one. What is the experience of multilingual Canadians with monolingual CBC programming? Again, I'm just trying to give you a sense of the kinds of potentially disturbing questions that you can start asking when you are motivated sociologically. That's my first motivation. And as I mentioned earlier, my other motivation is to give you some sense of how the varied definitions, varied conceptual understandings of sociology can express themselves. I'm looking at that first question, and that strikes me, at least I was trying to craft it, as a kind of correlational question. Perhaps there's a rule, perhaps there's a law governing the correlation between the CBC and the impact it has differentially across groups. The second question I was trying to lend a sense of Ginsberg's notion of human interactions and interrelations. I'm trying to weave human experience into the question. And in the final one, I'm trying to bring the lens in from a macro to a micro perspective. I mean, if I were to do a study around that third question, I would have to go out and talk to multilingual Canadians. So there would already be a large element of human interaction between myself as the researcher and the multilingual research participant. Right? Again, just to give you a sense of the broad range and the fact that those questions can be conceptually different, textually different. Add some. Can somebody add a question here? If you could stick to the CBC, that would be great, but you don't have to. Yes?
But what is the difference in experience when CBC is translated to other languages or through, as you kind of the French version of CBC? Is the presentation the same in terms of politics, religion, culture?
Interesting. Very interesting. What happens to the CBC in translation? Or watching Hockey Night in Canada in Urdu? I mean, what happens there? What kind of cultural streams do we have to cross? Very interesting question. Yes?
Like what impact does CBC's commentary or analysis have on the thoughts and opinions of the people who watch it?
Very good question. I've actually thought about that a lot. I don't watch CBC as much as I used to because I'm getting a little bit cynical around the CBC. Wonderful question around what impact does commentary on the CBC have on how Canadians think about the election, the economy? Great question. Yes?
Perhaps what factors affect what is covered and what is not covered?
Great question. Who gets to decide what gets covered? Yes?
How do people with disabilities interact with CBC?
Lovely question. I'm repeating myself in part for the benefit of the video. Yeah. How do Canadians with disabilities interact with the CBC? Absolutely. The second thematic category, economics. Does the absence of a national, don't worry, when we get to sociology of education, you're going first. I'm going first now, but you'll be going first after. Does the absence of a national daycare strategy in Canada affect relative levels of affluence and poverty? This is a sociologically informed question. Are the income levels of Canadian university graduates differentiated by processes of racialization? Do visible minorities with a BA make less money than BAs from the dominant group? That's a sociologically informed question. How do income levels affect the health of infants and mothers in Canadian urban centers? Again, this is a sociologically informed question. And again, 2 points to the method to my madness. One, I want to give you a sense of the really, really broad range of potential questions you can ask. And secondly, to give you a sense of how our three fathers of sociology might be translated into the type of question that's asked. The first one, again, is a potentially correlational study or correlational question that might be governed by a law or a rule. The second one gets closer to the texture of human experience and human interaction. And the third one, at least in my case, working with immigrant mothers and their infants, gets even deeper and factors me into it. Right? It drags my effective response to a mother fighting a deportation order. Right? And of course, if we went to the fourth step, we would start asking even more questions like, well, Professor Ippolito, why the heck are you doing that research in the first place? Who's funding your research? Why are you asking these questions? Add to our list. Yes?
How do income levels affect the integration of disabled persons in society?
How do income levels affect the integration of disabled persons in society? Wonderful. Yes?
Would there be an income change for citizens that are considered second level Canadian citizens?
Try that again. This is hard. I'm asking you to think in questions. This is counterintuitive.
Well, Canada recently decided on categorizing their citizens from first grade and second grade, and I would wonder if there is going to be a change in between the income levels of either of the two.
Good question. I drive my students nuts. They give me observations and I tell them and I challenge them. I say, okay, translate it into the form of a question. Well, and more often than not, they'll give me another statement. And then I'll push them again and they'll say, no, I want it in the form of a question. Because a question commits you, right? It forces you to focus on a particular task, conceptual or practical. I might be moving too slowly. And finally, immigration and acculturation. 3 examples. What key factors determine the extent to which minority groups in Canada assimilate into dominant Canadian society? Again, you can imagine this as a type of potentially a correlational study. Do immigrants from conflict zones face specific obstacles in acculturating to mainstream Canadian society? This one is moving a little bit closer to Ginsberg, a little bit closer to the texture of human interactions and human interrelations. And finally, what social factors impact the process of identity formation in children without formal schooling emigrating to Canada? Right. Again, to scratch below the surface of that question, well, you would have to interact with some of these kids. And as soon as you start interacting with them, you have a relationship with them, whether you like it or not. Moving ahead. So again, by way of summary, 2 broad observations. As I've mentioned, what I'm seeing here is an evolution in the focus of sociology. From the science, the hard science of social phenomena, to the study of human interactions and interrelations, to our own behavior as social beings. We become part of the equation. I chose this picture because in addition to the some well-worn sociological categories like age, race, and gender, I also see humor, music, and urbanscapes. Equally valid and interesting sociological variables. And the other broad observation, what you see over the last 150 years is a potential broadening, in fact, a de facto broadening of the range of possible questions you can ask. From macro-level concerns around potential rule-governed correlations following Comte, do budget cuts at the CBDC reduce its social impact? To the texture of interactions among individuals and groups, how do Canada's wealthiest citizens view poverty? You'd have to ask them. And finally, moving almost skipping past the third and into the fourth area of a post-structural sociology, what's the role of research and researchers in conducting sociological studies? For example, what ethical issues do researchers face in studying homelessness? Does a researcher have a responsibility when studying homelessness? Comte probably would have said, if there had been research on homelessness, perhaps there was, I don't know, he probably would have said that's not a relevant question. It's impossible for that question to be irrelevant in 2015 because we've moved. Sociology has moved. Okay, let's move to sociology of education, from sociology to sociology of education. And I'm going to three, again, suspicious that they're all males, three more fathers of sociology who had something very, very direct to say to sociology of education. Durkheim, Althusser, and Dewey. You're probably tired of hearing my voice by now. This is Durkheim. Again, for those of you who have done a Sociology 1A1 course, this is probably going to sound familiar. This is the classic functionalist view of education. Right? What's the role of education? The purpose of education is to prepare students to fulfill roles in society. Societies have to reproduce themselves. They need people to fill particular roles so the whole thing doesn't collapse. And that's where education comes in. When I ask my students in other B.Ed courses, when I've asked them over the years, so what is the purpose of education? The immediate knee-jerk response is, well, to prepare kids for society. And then there's a silence for a few seconds, and then other hands start. Well, I don't know if that's true, right? But it's interesting how this seems to be the knee-jerk response in my experience from students. Let's turn to the Marxist, Louis Althusser. The high priests of the ruling ideology, its functionaries. He probably has, among others, he probably has school principals in mind there. They're key functionaries. And again, this will be very familiar to some of you. This is the classic conflict view of education. Education perpetuates existing social inequalities by preparing students to fulfill specific roles in society. So in many ways, they're in agreement with the functionalists. Yeah, that's what education does. Education prepares kids to fulfill roles in societies. But, add the Marxists like Althusser, in so doing, education is perfectly placed to reproduce existing inequalities. And it does it very well, generation after generation. And third and finally, John Dewey. Dewey is typically taken up in philosophy and called a pragmatist. I'm taking him up in the context of sociology and calling him a symbolic interactionist. And in the symbolic interactional view of education, teachers and students interpret each other's interactions and thereby form expectations of each other and themselves. So you can see a really important shift in focus here. The simplest way to put it is you shift from a macro-level view of society to a micro-level view. Rather than thinking about the broad structures of reproduction and preparation, you're focusing on how you and I interact. And the symbolic interactionists, the footnote they add there is that teachers and students, for example, understand each other, interpret each other based on what they think is true. And what they think is true is obviously informed by their own set of experiences, their own knowledge. Right? So at the center of the process for the symbolic interaction is interpretation of objects, which include other people. Don't write too much. We're going to be posting these, right? How am I doing for time? Okay. Okay, you go first. What kind of questions might a sociology of education pose in the context of communication? Think big, think small, think widely.
What groups of students are most likely to be suspended or expelled?
Which group of students are most likely to be, or at highest risk of being suspended or expelled? Great question.
Children of immigrant families who listen to CBC adapt more quickly into Canadian schools.
That's a good question. We would have to talk about adapt because there's a process being invoked there and it needs to be troubled a bit, but it's a great question. Do the children of kids from minority families, immigrant families, who do listen to the CBC, do they adapt to Canadian society or Canadian schooling more quickly, more easily? Interesting question. Here.
TDSB used as a tool for simulating hegemonic values.
Is the TDSB used as a, or does the TDSB function as a tool for, finish it again? Disseminating hegemonic values of what is Canadian. Tough question, a loaded question, but an important sociological question. Absolutely. Yes?
What is the effect of having a teacher that is the same race as the students for the amount of learning that the students can do?
Okay, again, notwithstanding the fact that we would need a course to at least 4 months to unpack the notion of race, the question is, what impact does a purported racial similarity between teacher and student, what kind of impact does that have on the student's learning? Okay? Yes, one up there. Good, this is good.
Yeah,
This is good, he's thinking through the question.
what is the best manner of facilitating the transfer of knowledge from educator to student?
It's a good start.
In terms of, so, like, just what I had in mind is like, you now are giving a lecture to a room full of 300, 250 people. Is that the best format for transmitting that?
Great question, great question. You're going to read a piece by Elliot Eisner in the philosophy module, and one of the observations that Eisner makes is, he says, the architecture of the classroom mirrors the architecture of the learning, which I think is very interesting in the context of a pit like this. I'll share 3 very quickly with you. How many years does it take English language learners to move from stage 1 to stage 4 language acquisition as outlined in the Ontario curriculum? That strikes me as a functional kind of question. How long is it going to take these kids to come up to speed so they can start fulfilling roles in society? Does socioeconomic background affect how newcomer students move through the stages of acculturation as outlined in the Ontario curriculum? Do poor immigrant kids learn English at a slower rate than wealthier immigrant children? Might be a related question. Right? So again, this is informed by socioeconomics and a conflict theory of education. Clearly, it's invoking a potential inequality, and it wants to scratch below the surface. How do multilingual students interpret monolingual classroom media? How do multilingual students interpret monolingual classroom teachers? Again, here the focus is informed by a symbolic interactional perspective, which says the focus of importance for us is on how people read each other. How you read your students and why, and how your students read you and why. Economics. What kind of economic or socioeconomic question might be relevant in a study of education? Up there.
The success rates of students from private schools.
Yeah, is there a difference between the success rates of students attending private versus public schools? Great. Yes? I'm sorry, a little bit louder?
Do students with wealthier backgrounds learn better than students from working class backgrounds or poorer backgrounds?
That's a good start. Do wealthier students learn better? If I were supervising an MRP or a thesis for you, I would push you to refine the question, but it's a very good start. Yeah. I want to leave some time for our videos. How effectively does the Ontario secondary school curriculum prepare students for the workforce? Functionalism. Why are students from lower income families more likely to choose applied rather than academic courses? This is a so-called critically informed perspective. I haven't used that word yet, but it's often tied to conflict theories, i.e. Marxist theories. How do children living in poverty experience classroom learning? What role do teachers play in these experiences? Here we're squarely at the experiential level. And this is where the symbolic interactional view is relevant. Last one, immigration and acculturation. Pose a sociologically driven question relevant to education in the area of immigration and acculturation. Yes?
How would students respond to ethical, moral, or political questions, whether they were educated in a public board or in a Catholic school board?
Okay, so you're invoking the public versus separate school dichotomy and asking whether that has an impact on the student experience. And immediately behind you. How do children from immigrant families perform in school compared to students who are born in Canada? That would be the beginning of a very interesting and important study. And there's a lot of work in this field. Yeah. What priorities characterize the work of guidance counselors with secondary students recently arrived in Canada? Right? Could be read as a functional question. Are secondary school guidance counselors doing their work? Or perhaps, what work are they doing in preparing students to fulfill roles in society? How does an assimilationist ideology serve the larger project of preparing newcomer students for a capitalist economy? You're going to, by the time you get through this program and by the time you've spent some time in public classrooms, the word critical will be coming in and out of your ears at the speed of light probably about 10 times a day. And it means, just as a caution, it means different things to different levels. It means something at the policy level, it means something at the ministry level, it means something at the board level, it means something at the classroom level. But just to give you the heads up, this is one of its more originary meanings, tied as it is to a Marxist framework, to a conflict framework. And finally, how do school administrators understand and respond to culturally informed views of gender among religiously diverse families? How do you respond intelligently, ethically, and sensitively to cultural differences and preferences that are informed by religious values that may not be the same as yours? Tough questions for educators. Really, really difficult questions. Again, two very broad observations. Functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Each of them has I won't say slightly, I'll say a dramatically different focus. They're each trying to do different things. Right? And what's pertinent to our project here is that they will inform different kinds of questions. They'll prod you to ask different kinds of questions about what you're seeing and doing in a classroom. This is what I mean. If we follow Durkheim and functionalism, the question might be, how does public education create good citizens? If we follow the Marxists, it might be, how does public education create critical thinkers who can change society? You ask a Marxist, what's the purpose of education? And they'll say, the purpose of education is to change society, not to prepare students to reproduce society. And finally, to the micro-level perspective of the symbolic interactionists, how does public education create individuals more attuned to each other's needs? How do you encourage the development of caring students in your classrooms? What do I have here? Probably stuff that I've already said. Sociology of education is clearly an infinite set of questions. It's a varied set of tools that will give rise to different kinds of questions. But one thing it has in common across those conceptual frameworks is that the focus is on inquiry, on asking questions that drag us below the surface of what we see. For analyzing public education, for generating a research perspective, this is what I meant by putting us into a research frame of mind. Into a frame of mind where we walk into a classroom and the kinds of questions that you've shared with us this afternoon pop to mind, right? Yes, you'll ask the pedagogical questions, the kind of benign pedagogical questions like, what's this teacher's approach to classroom management? How does this teacher integrate lesson planning into unit planning? Those are all important questions, but they're not, strictly speaking, the kind of sociologically edged questions that I've been hearing from the floor, right? That should be another conversation that should inform your learning in a classroom. That's one of my research schools in Markham, where 80% of the families at home speak Tamil as a first language. It's a fascinating school. It's a lovely school, but a really fascinating socio-linguistic dynamic at play there. Very exciting place to study and to teach. Okay, how much time do we have left? About 15 minutes. Maybe we can get to some of the shorter videos, and the longer ones I will post. Actually, the links are in the PowerPoint here. I've got 3 of them. Let's go back for a second. No, I've got 4 of them. I've got one relevant to policy, 1 relevant to educational research, and 2 relevant to classroom practice. And as we make our way through these videos, I want you to think about these questions. They might be a kind of sociological prompt for you. What question seems important to you? Why are you asking it? I have to ask that question because I'm not posing this at 1839. I'm posing this task to you in 2015, so I have to ask the supplementary question. Why are you asking it? And crucially, what implications might it have for what you do in a classroom? Why don't we go to, the first one is short. Ken Robinson, do you know that video, Changing Educational Paradigms? Write it down and go to YouTube tonight. It's 11 minutes, really fascinating. Really, really good stuff. Very listenable. He's a British author who kind of speaks everywhere around the world on matters related to education. This particular clip is on him talking about the future of educational policy. So, again, maybe just take a second to jot these questions down so you know what or perhaps how to look. What question seems important to you? Why are you asking it? And implications for classroom practice.
I do feel strongly and passionately that education is the most important gift that we can give to people. That every individual can be transformed with the right educational opportunity. It's no exaggeration to say that our children will be inheriting challenges that no previous generations had to deal with. And if we fail to equip them to deal with these challenges, we will have failed them and put them in a position which may be intolerable. The real role of policy, I believe, is to create a climate in which innovation is possible and self-determination is encouraged. Because however committed politicians may be at whatever level they operate to school improvement, they're not going to be doing it. That's the work of principals and of teachers and of parents and of the students in the system. human beings have deep opinions about everything that happens to them. And if they're in a system that feels alienating or cold or abusive, they pull away from it. Everything has to be adapted to local circumstance. It has to be customized to these people, to this community. Every now and then, you have a game-changing technology. And information technologies, I think, have made the existing systems of education largely redundant. They have changed the nature of work. They've changed the gateways to ideas and information. They have challenged the traditional roles of teachers, and they have contributed to making the current systems of education antiquated and largely pointless. The good news is they also offer some of the means by which the system can be reinvented, which, as I see it, has to be based on personalized education, customized curricula, systems of education which are inherently creative and inquiring and curious, and where the divisions between generations are also dissolved. And then, if the climate's right, as we've seen in other countries, you get a harvest of human achievement that you couldn't have anticipated.
If you were provoked by what he said there, go and check out Changing Educational Paradigms on YouTube tonight. What kind of question, sociologically driven question, might that set of remarks encourage you to ask? Yes?
How can we possibly customize education in a country that's as large and as diverse as Canada is? How would we actually go about doing that?
Okay, the particularities of customization, okay. I'm in a teacher education program. What the heck does policy have to do with me? Sorry, we're going to go here first.
How often can we change the policies to accommodate all the student needs?
How can we change policy? It's a very...
How often?
How often? Very interesting. It typically moves at a snail's pace. Yeah. And a hand right behind.
Oh, I was going to say, what areas of education get left behind when the future of education is so technologically focused?
Very, very interesting question around the impact of digital technologies. I mean, did you miss that? He said that basically what you're preparing to do in a classroom is pointless. I'm not asking you to agree with him, but if you're not provoked by that, you were sleeping. Yes?
It seems from that clip that the way of the future, as this person's outlining it, is that the teaching present in the classroom might even be obsolete. In the sense that we have so much technology, we just use Skype or use or robot anything.
So the question I hear you asking is, are teachers irrelevant?
At least that's the way
Yep. He's not the only one. James G., a very well-known linguist, makes the same point. He says computer programmers have a way better understanding of learning than traditional teachers and educators. Yes?
Are we providing education to our kids to prepare them for a better world, or are they just another brick in the wall?
Are we preparing our kids to create a better world, or are they just bricks in a wall? We haven't heard from here.
Just more of a response to the question that was asked a moment ago, is are teachers and/or the classroom obsolete? My question in response to that is, what will be the sociological impact of not having students in a classroom anymore?
Excellent question. Fascinating. I want you to think of these things when you're sitting in your classroom practicum observations. Straight off the bat, I want you to allow yourself to imagine those questions. No, you're not being disloyal. No, you're not fulfilling an irresponsible role. I would argue quite the opposite. You're being responsible by asking those difficult questions. Because that's what makes you a more careful and a more thoughtful and a more intelligent and a more ethical educator. And I think Lisa made this point earlier. Rather than walking in, and this is difficult because so many of the myths in education will tell you a good teacher is the confident teacher that strides into the classroom and has the class under control. And we're encouraging you to do something else. I'm encouraging you to walk in there as if you're kind of walking on thin ice. And you're not sure what the impact of your foot in that place is going to have. There's a hand up here.
I was going to say, considering how the video seems like an advertisement for Microsoft, we are asking how beneficial really is it to allow a neoliberal policy to inform educational policy, I guess, or in other ways, how good is it for education to have corporations enter the schools?
Excellent question. Excellent question. How complicit is Microsoft in Ken Robinson's work in putting forward a particular vision of education? Excellent question. Do we have time for one more? One more short video? One more hand here. Yeah, one more short.
I forgot what I was going to say. It's okay, just go on.
Yeah? Oh, yeah, we're good? I mean, at this point, I know that at least some of you are still saying, yeah, policy, okay. And I could put the research one, I encourage you to visit these, they're short links on YouTube. The research one is a short clip of a documentary on teachers, on practicing teachers who conducted research as part of an in-service graduate program with a university in the US that I can't remember. Really interesting because what I saw there were teachers, practicing teachers, grade school teachers, in a research frame of mind. Yeah, they were asking all the unit plan and lesson plan questions. They were all also worried about what I call the Monday morning question. Yeah, but what the heck am I going to do Monday morning? But they were also making room for what I'm calling the research perspective. They were also asking those other difficult questions. And then I've got two on classroom practice. One is way too long for the time we have left. The short one is grade 9 language arts lesson. So again, your questions, what question seems important to you? Why are you asking it? And what implications might it have for your classroom practice? Yeah, that's short, that's 3. No, that's the long one. We're going to go to the grade 4 math lesson because it's shorter.
Do a review lesson today for our test, boys and girls. I will apply what I have learned about expressions, equations, and patterns to solve problems. I will defend my answer to my group using words, numbers, and pictures. Okay, so we talked a lot about expressions, variables, and equations this lesson. Who remembers what an expression is? Who remembers what an expression is? Jill?
It's a problem with like a letter in it, like 5 times E equals 10.
Okay, all right, so it's a problem with a letter in it, but it doesn't have an equal sign, right? An equation is a sentence that contains an equal sign showing that two expressions are equal. So 4 plus x equals 9. Did everybody remember that? Okay, and x is called a what? What is x called? Isaac? A variable. Very good. Okay, so today it says I'm going to defend my answer to my group using words, numbers, and pictures. Who can explain to me how I do that? How do I defend my answer to my group? Do I just yell out the answer I got? What do I do? Alex?
You start from 1, 2, 3, and 4, and tell them and explain them what answer you got.
Okay, so Yesenia's a 1, Jay's a 2, you're a 3, and Ashlyn's a 4. So does Ashlyn go first? No. Yesenia goes first, and does she just say, I got 5?
No, she has to explain her answer.
She has to explain her answer and show her work to you, right? So once you defend your answer and you're 3 of you have it right, and one of you has it wrong, what do? Alyssa?
You, the other people got it right, you hope the other one got it wrong.
So the 3 that got it right become the teacher, and the one that got it wrong tries to figure out how to get it right. Correct? And then I'm going to have one of you stand up. I'll say all number 2 stand up, and you'll rotate groups. And you'll explain to the next group how to do it.
Logical questions. How did she set up the lesson? How did she interact with her students? What does the lesson look like? Those are important questions. But what I would implore you not to do is to leave the research perspective behind. I would encourage you to continue to entertain those other kinds of questions. The infinite set of questions.
Stand up, please.
The millions of questions that you can be asking here that dig below the surface. I would rather hear somebody else's voice conclude our talk rather than me. What question are you asking? Why are you asking it? And what implication might it have for what you do in a classroom?
The question is, how might we conduct and customize the classroom to be inclusive and interactive for all students while also respecting and meeting their individual needs?
Okay, how do we create an inclusive classroom that also respects needs? Why are you asking it?
I'm asking it so as to make sure that all students, no matter what needs they may need, no matter how many different the subject is, everyone gets the same equal opportunities to be able to challenge the questions, challenge the assignment, and to
Wonderful.
on top.
Wonderful.
Say, I understand it, I know, and I can take this knowledge with me.
Wonderful. Challenging the question. This is lovely. And what implication might it have by extension for your practice?
Well, it would mean that essentially I would be, recycling every single assignment or how I conduct the classroom every day. Every day would have to be something new, completely different. Make sure that it's not just a boring class that everyone sits in. It's something that I'm coming in, I'm going to participate, I'm really enjoy this. I'm here to enjoy my education. I'm not here because it's an obligation. I shouldn't have to feel like it's an obligation. I want it. That's what the student should really feel when they come to the classroom.
Thank you for concluding our talk. Thank you.